Good evening, everyone. I want to thank everyone who's in attendance tonight for the Maine-Endwell School District Annual Budget Hearing. Tonight, we are live streaming as we have our other budget workshops. So for the audience who is watching at home, if you have a question that you would like an answer to, we will mention this again later tonight, but there is a budget chat following tonight's meeting from 7 to 8, and you can certainly ask any question that generates from tonight's budget hearing at that 7 to 8 o'clock budget hearing, budget chat. So without any further ado, tonight we will be reviewing two items that will be up for vote on May 15th, along with our Board of Education elections, which we do not cover tonight. First will be the approval of the spending plan of $52.4 million, which I will go over tonight and answer any questions that the public may have. Also, Proposition 1, purchasing of 5 school buses, 3 full-size, 1 full-size wheelchair, and 1 truck SUV, not to exceed $530,500. So again, if there are any questions regarding these two items, I will be reviewing them tonight and will answer any questions that come up from the public. The objectives for the 18-19 budget, and this is where I'm going to spend the majority of the time, is reviewing. Number one, we made a conscious decision to reduce our reliance on reserve and fund balance use, and I'll show where that is coming from, why the need for that, to pay for recurring revenues, recurring operating expenditures. Also, we are addressing the structural imbalance of expenditures exceeding revenue through this budget, and we are keeping all student programs intact. That was our objective for 18-19, and that is what, moving forward, you'll see through this presentation. So just a timeline of key budget development. First, we have started the budget. So this is about a 6 to 8 month process to develop a budget each year. We're constantly developing months and months and months ahead of the actual budget going into effect. Starting in November and December, we started generating expenditures requests from our staff. Then we had our first budget workshop. The last 7 years, we've used budget workshops, typically between 4 or 5 a year. You'll note from January through April, we had 5 this year, and those are the topics that we cover. Typically, we spend most of our time on the expenditure side, since the revenue is typically the last piece of information we receive. And as you'll see later, 97% of our revenue is based on either state aid or the tax levy. So again, we spend the majority of our time looking at expenditures. Also, tonight, as you'll note, highlighted our budget hearing, and there's our budget chat. So again, I want to just put a plug in for the budget chat. If there's a question you have as a result of tonight that you want answered and you're not in attendance at home, you can certainly access budget chat and ask that question. And then obviously May 15th is our budget vote. One item I do want to recognize, the Board of Education asked if we could create another layer of transparency this year and to live stream all of our budget workshops and obviously our budget hearing, and we have done that. So the value of making sure that if you can't be physically in attendance, but you have access to the information and it's saved so that you can view it over and over again if you wish, is a huge improvement this year to our process. So again, I want to make sure that, give kudos to where they belong. I do not know of any local school districts that go to this degree to be transparent and open. So again, I want to thank everybody. It's been it's been a great experience on our part too. All right, so let's get right into final recommendations for 18-19. First of all, the first recommendation that we've been working off of is to stay at the tax levy limit. So the tax levy limit is 2.08. Any request to go above the tax levy limit requires a supermajority vote of 60% or more of the voting population. And we'll talk about this to a certain degree, going over the tax levy limit forfeits your taxpayer's ability to receive the tax relief check that comes from New York State each year, the rebate check. So there are circumstances that make it difficult to choose to do that. We did spend an entire budget workshop reviewing this decision. There was serious consideration In the end, though, the recommendation is to stay at 2.08. And the 2.08 generates that additional revenue from the year before. And we'll come back to that number. So typically, when we put out our budget newsletter, we get questions saying, you said the tax levy was 2.08, but whenever I get my tax bill, it's never 2.08, it's some other number. And so we've tried to educate our community over the last several years that tax levy is what we're asking the community to pay additionally from the year before. What you pay as an actual rate on your bill is determined based on two other factors that we don't control. Where you live and how your property's assessed, and then obviously the New York State equalization rate, which is a New York State set rate that's meant to stabilize property valuations. So when you take that into effect, when you look at the Maine-Endwell Central School District, there are 7,414 parcels. The two biggest majority areas, towns, Town of Maine, Town of Union, that represents about 97%, almost 98% of the properties that make up the Maine-Endwell School District. But what you'll note is a budget of $52.4 million. The tax levy we're generating is $23.9 million. How it's distributed is based on the total taxable assessment and the equalization rate. Again, one is based on the town you live in, one is based on New York State. So the 2.08 is simply how much money the school is asking all of those communities, members, to generate for us. And then how that's determined based on valuation of property and equalization rate. So every year we do answer those questions, and it's confusing and it's difficult at times, but again, there is an answer to it. With that said, this is really just a historical perspective. I think it's important to note that there is a law that went into effect in 1213 that limits how much a school district can generate without needing an additional voter approval. Since 2012-13, in pink, I guess on your screen if that looks pink, those are the years in which the tax levy limit has been in effect. If you look at 11 years, going back to 8-9, previous to the law, or prior to the law, you can see what our average was total, and then with the tax levy law in effect. And actually, the 4 years prior to the tax levy limit was about a 1.3% increase. So what's the significance of that? When the tax levy limit law went into effect, the assumption was it was 2%. And the hope was, I think at the time now, in hindsight, that it would be 2% every year. Well, in reality, because of how the formula is calculated, based on inflation, based on growth value of your community, there are other factors. So the 2% has actually, as you looked up until 1819, was a slow decline. What's the significance of that? That's the second largest source of revenue for the district. And so if the tax levy limit is shrinking or is smaller than years past, that's less revenue we can ask and generate from the local tax share. Unless we exceed the tax levy limit, and then of course we have to get the 60% voter approval. And in the last 3 years with the rebate added in, it's that extra item that we have to contend with. So this is a major issue when years that the tax levy limit is low. Thankfully for 2018-19, it has bounced back to 2.08. And while I hate to say that because I know as a taxpayer people think, well, I don't want to hear that the rate's going up. As a district who needs the revenue, we want to see that number as close to 2 as we can. So that's one silver lining in that regard. Now, one of the questions we had looked at during the budget process, development process, was, so what do the outer years look like? If we don't want to have years of, under 2, under 1% tax levy, and we want to smooth out the tax levy limit and, potentially ask voters to approve a limit above the, or a levy above the limit, we want to kind of have an idea. Looking out over the next 3 years at the current variables, we're trending close to a 2%. So that's good news looking out, but again, those aren't necessarily accurate numbers this early on. So the second recommendation is to follow the advice and the purpose of Board Policy 3910. And I highlighted down below, and I think it's important to read the first sentence, not that you can't read it, but I want to read it just because it resonates with me and hopefully with everyone. The Board of Education recognizes that good fiscal management compromises the foundational support of the entire district. So the essence there is, without a sound financial base, you're compromising the ability to do what our job is, and that's to educate students. And certainly for us at Maine-Endwell, it's a premier education, not just a education. So this concept of being financially stable and making sure that you're healthy is critical and foundational to what we do. Now, one of the areas that we have addressed over the last 5 years and continue to manage is fund balance. And a lot of people ask the question, well, what is fund balance? And we spent a lot of time this year hopefully giving an explanation of what it is. Fund balance is all of the money, and I'm paraphrasing and summarizing very, very elementary. It's all of the money left over after expenses. So from a very elementary standpoint, if you don't have a lot of money left over after you pay your expenditures, then you don't have the ability to take on unexpected consequences or situations that arise. And so it's very simple when the comptroller's office says low fund balance can result in fiscal stress. And we went through fiscal stress for several years. We're very well versed on what it looks like and the consequences it have. And going forward, our goal has been to never return to the situation where we are unhealthy. Now, the other thing about fund balance is you take the money you have left over and you have a couple options. You can reserve it, so you place it in a reserve with specific uses, and we'll show you those reserves, or you can either assign it, which means place it, use it somewhere specifically, or don't assign it, leave it unassigned, and it's essentially free cash that is available from a discretionary standpoint as needed. So that's fund balance. And as you can imagine, again, going back to the very simple premise, if you don't have any money left over after you pay your expenses, then you're in a poor position in the event unforeseen circumstances arise. So you always want to have money on hand in the event of unforeseen circumstances. And unforeseen circumstances can be 3 or 4 students moving into a district with no notice that have high needs that now need to have services provided to them, all the way to an unexpected capital issue that arises, or the need to hire an additional teacher based on enrollment 3 weeks before school starts. So when you have extra cash, it gives you the cushion to be able to do that. So in 2013, we had our last official comprehensive audit from the OSC. This was a time when we were coming off of really difficult budget times, and the audit was quite, I don't want to say difficult to take, but it was pretty prescriptive. And so the prescription from the OSC was, you need to take fund balance serious. It's a big deal when you don't have fund balance, and it's a big deal when you use it to pay recurring expenses and you can't replenish it. And what was probably the most telling was, and this was obviously we blew it up in blue to make it stand out, but this was in bold on the report. Their recommendation was, do not rely on fund balance to balance your budget as a normal financing source. So we've taken that to heart over the last several years. And here's why. So you have to kind of step back historically to understand why that's a big deal today. So on the screen, you'll note that you're looking at 2009, 10, 10, 11, 11, 12, and you see an orange line and you see a green line. So I want to focus on the green line first. The green line represents the amount of fund balance the district assigned to the budget. So expenditures come in, and revenues below what your expenditures are, you assign fund balance to make up the difference. It's that free money that you have to decide what you want to do with. Reserve, assign it, or keep it unassigned. Well, the district over the 3-year period of 9, 10, 10, 11, 11, 12 assigned 187, 1.9 million, 3 million for a 3-year use of $5.2 million. So they assigned funds to cover expenses of $5.2 million. Now, without going into great depths of this orange line, at the same time, the district also received, this was stimulus money when President Obama came in and we were in the Great Recession, the federal government handed out essentially aid for communities and school districts. This orange line represents that aid, that federal aid that came in. Now, I point to 12-13 as kind of a starting point because the federal funds ran out, and because of the stark use, the real sharp use of fund balance, we were essentially out of fund balance at the end of that year. That's why that number drops off significantly. So then fast forward to where we are now. It took several years to build back fund balance, and without reliving the difficult times of 12-13 and 13-14, we made significant reductions to expenditures, notably staffing. We made reductions of over 100 staff members in 12-13, 13-14. And people always say, well, why? Because when you prop up your expenditure side with funds that you can't replenish, and you don't reduce the expenditures eventually, you're going to have to make the decision to, if you want to make up some revenue and have reserve money, it's got to come from somewhere, and it had to come from making reductions on the expenditure side. So we had to balance our revenue with our expenditures and stop using fund balance to create the cushion between what we were receiving and what we were spending. Now, fast forward to 14, 15, 15, 16, 16, 17. Healthy. That's 4% per state law. We're right on target what a healthy budget should look like. Our reserves have grown significantly into healthy zones where they should be. And again, I'll talk about what each of those are. But what we noticed in 17-18 and what was continuing for 18-19 without the decisions we made is that this curve was going to start down again. We were in a position where if we don't stop using fund balance and reserves, we're going to be back to where we were here. So when I say the objectives of this year was to stop reliance on fund balance and to make sure that we were writing our expenditures versus revenue, that's exactly what we're trying to do with this budget. And this chart really shows why we need to do that, why that's a priority. So moving on from that point, we also said in the last 5 years that we need to have a plan for replenishing reserves. We can't simply use money and then never plan on putting it back. And the best analogy I can use, I've tried to use with staff, is everyone typically has a savings account. If you use your savings account to pay your cell phone bill or your electric bill month after month after month, you eventually won't have a savings account. And then you're going to have to make a decision of, do I stop paying for electric to have a savings, or do I just live without a savings? Now, again, can't tell you what people's choices are. In our case, we don't have the luxury of choosing to not have electric. So from an analogy standpoint, we cannot operate without reserves. So if we don't have a plan for replenishing reserves, then we're in trouble. So the recommendation here to keep our reserves in front of us is for that reason alone. So looking at our current reserves, to start the year, we were at 6.7 million. We purposefully used about $750,000 in reserves, partly or primarily to cover the gap between the revenue shortage. We had a revenue shortage. We made the decision to use reserves and fund balance. So I want to pause for a second. People say, but you have reserves and extra money for rainy day situations. Absolutely. However, the pattern we're following is if every year expenses keep going up and revenue's not following, then we are creating that gap again where revenues are far below expenditures and we're going to have to use our savings to pay for it unless we make some difficult decisions. So talking about reserves, one item I want to mention, and I know this has come up before, and I want to be clear on this. Each of these reserves have specific criteria as to what you can put in, how much, and what they're used for. So for example, retirement contribution reserve. It's our largest reserve or second largest, by about $1,000. Second largest. It's strictly for paying employee retirement pensions. So all non-instructional employees who are part of ERS, we can pay for that bill annually out of that reserve. And good practice is having 3 to 5 years worth of that cost in a reserve. we're at about 3 years, 3.5 years worth of that cost. So, can we use retirement contribution reserve for anything other than pension? No. Pension solely. Tax certiorari reserve is for any claims where we owe a refund. So while we have $484,000 and we're using a little bit this year, we have that money can only be used if there's a claim against the district and we owe people money. So again, can't use it for anything other than that. Unemployment insurance reserve, it's probably pretty obvious what that use is. Capital reserve, and I highlighted that because we did use some capital reserve. We bought the property adjacent to the high school for $165,000. That is an approved use of the capital reserve. Capital improvement, land acquisition, those are all acceptable uses. So that money can only be used for those purposes. We did use it for that purpose. Did not come out of the operating general fund. That was strictly came out of reserve, which is, again, one of the only uses we could do with it. And then accrued liability reserve, this is for employee separations. So insurance buyouts, sick day buyouts, retirement incentives, we can use this fund for that. So the bottom line is this: when you look at your reserves and say, well, you've got $6 million worth of reserves, why don't you use reserves to, keep positions or keep programs? Because these reserves have specific uses, you can't just simply use them for operating expenses. And it's critical to know that. And that these amounts, while at first blush may seem excessive, are absolutely in line with what's appropriate and acceptable per CBO and then per, obviously, the comptroller's office. So that's healthy. That's a good thing right there, to see those kind of reserves. Now, to see this number constantly dwindle, that's why this recommendation is critical, because while we can have reserves and use them, you have to think about replenishing them too. So let's get to the 18-19 budget. On the expenditure side, $1.2 million growth from year to year. So 17-18, 51.2, 18-19, 52.4, 1.2 million increase, or 2.35%. So that is our expenditure growth year to year, 2.35%. Now, breaking that out in our budget newsletter, we create a 3-part budget. This is our administrative or general support budget, represents 10% of our total budget. You'll see the growth is $58,000 from year to year, or about 1.1% growth in administrative. In our capital, which represents 21%, you'll note a fairly large increase of 7.2%, or 737. I would note that the supermajority of that amount is based on the 2014 capital project principal coming online that we now are paying for. However, as you'll see next in the revenue side, that is offset by building aid from state. So that number actually washes out based on the state aid coming in to counter that. But it's obviously a huge increase dollar for dollar. And then program, where 69% of our budget is spent, as you would imagine, all of our instructional, our related service, all of our staff that work in classrooms and in buildings, not to mention all of our student activities, and then our transportation, and then employee benefits, which is a huge number. That number is growing at $412,000, or about 1.2%. Now, I pause for a second because these numbers include significant reductions of about $1.3 million on salaries and health insurance benefits due to reductions in staffing, which we'll cover later on. So while that number, we had talked about health insurance growing at a rate of nearly $900,000, it is growing at a rate of $900,000 until we made reductions for 18-19, and that number has since subsided. So again, didn't put a note in there, but that's why those numbers are a little smaller than maybe people saw in earlier budget workshops. So on the revenue picture, again, really simple. Here's our tax levy last year, here's our tax levy this year, that's the 2.08%. That's how much more additional money we're generating from the tax levy. Now, just to back up, that's all the money, the increase, not the money, the increase we're able to generate at 2.08%. If you go back to our expenditures, that's not even enough, or barely enough, to pay for, I should say barely enough to pay for just health insurance. So when you're looking at revenue and how do you pay for your bills, one line item, health insurance, is eating up practically all of the tax levy increase. So just something to keep in mind. Now, here's where we made the decisions to reduce our reliance on fund balance and reserve. You'll note last year we used almost $1 million. This year we've made the conscious decision to cut that by almost $700,000 to get back to, we can't use our savings to pay for expenses. We're going to have to reduce expenditures to get revenue and expenditures back in line. So that's a conscious decision to use less fund balance and reserve and make decisions on the expenditure side. And then obviously on the state aid side, people see 1.3 million and think, hey, that's great. It is great. Remember, 700,000 of that 1.3 is for building aid, which is the only place you can use it. So it's really around $700,000 of additional state aid that we have to use. So again, dollar to dollar, $1.2 million increase from year to year, or 2.35%. Now, the fourth recommendation, and there are 5, the fourth was, and while this says make reductions to staffing, not filling retirements and layoffs, it's not about reducing staffing to reduce staff. It's about finding a way to reduce reoccurring expenses that will allow us to even out our revenue and expenditure. And a lot of people say, well, why are you using staffing? In a school budget, when all is said and done and boiled down, there's about $3 million of discretionary funds that we can manage to offset. If we stopped buying all materials and supplies, if we eliminated all sports and extracurriculars, we're at about $1.5 million, give or take. So while that's an option, to operate a school district with no materials and supplies and to have no extracurriculars or co-curriculars for students, while doable, I'm not sure the public would necessarily support that, and I'm sure our staff would find that extremely difficult to do their job. So staffing becomes, in a people business, we're labor intensive, right? We employ people, it's a people business. That's the only area that you can look to make significant reductions. So that's an unfortunate situation, but it's really the only area we can look at seriously to make these kind of reductions. So this information has been out now. Again, this is not a great slide. This is not something I think we feel good about. It's an unfortunate situation based on many variables. But we will be making reductions of about 1.3 million because these two, instructional other, non-instructional other, is taking a salary that was in the general budget and moving it to the cafeteria. So the cafeteria fund is separate. So that's coming off our books. It's not a reduction. And then lead teacher team leaders are not, it's not a position, they're stipends. That number of people get a small sliver of money to do specific work. So that's not a person. But that's included in the 1.5 as well. And then the last recommendation was to continue with the bus replacement plan. The important thing to note here is 89% of our bus purchases are aided. So nearly 90 cents of a dollar is generated back to us in state aid. Then when you factor in the trade-in and whatever we get at the resale of the buses we're selling to replace, we've costed out that a brand new bus in Maine-Endwell is about $12,000. $12,000 divided out over 5 years. So buying 5 buses at $530,000 seems like a huge investment, but after state aid and then resale, ends up costing us about $60,000 on the market, divided out over 5 years. It is absolutely the best return on investment we can make. That's why every year we recommend that we keep doing this, because the state is incentivizing us to keep our buses up to date and new. And by not taking advantage of that seems like a poor investment on our part. So again, the recommendation was to continue to purchase buses and replace them as they get older and we need to. And then that's just the schedule of bus replacement. These are the buses that are being replaced and then the value, the trade-in value that we're expected to get, hopefully. So what happens if our budget is defeated? I'll go through this quickly. Not that it's not a possibility, but we've been very fortunate in the district. If the budget's defeated, the board has 2 options. Accept the contingency budget immediately, and I'll explain what that looks like. Or B, go out again for a second vote. And unfortunately, the second vote is needed to be done within 30 days of the first vote. So first vote happens May 15th, it's defeated. We have now 30 days to bring a vote back to the taxpayers, which obviously would be June 15th. And then we have to make a decision of either keeping the same one and hoping to get more support, or revising it and hopefully appeasing voters to hopefully then get a second approval, or an approval on the second vote. Option C is very rare, so I'm not going to go into that because after we studied it, it's not really an option. It's really A and B that are the realistic options. So we have to plan as if the budget is going to be defeated because it's always a possibility, even though Maine-Endwell has been a wonderful, supportive community. So what would a contingency budget looks like? So May 15th, 49% of the voters say yes, defeated budget. We have the option of reducing our budget by $486,000, which is essentially, it's last year's tax levy change. So the law says if you go to a contingency budget, then you automatically give up the tax levy you generated from the previous year. So this number is not a number made out of thin air. It's what the tax levy, 2.08, would generate. Now, if we go to that contingency budget, then there's a prescribed formula in where you have to make the reductions. So this is not us choosing to make these reductions. This is the formula that you have to accept through a contingency budget. So that $486,000 would be $50,000 out of administration and support, $336,000 out of program, $100,000 out of capital that we would have to then reduce our budget to bring it into line for a contingency budget. So that's one of the options in the event it was defeated. And then again, the other option is simply to go back out and hope to get, support. So again, I'm not sitting here trying to scare anyone, but we have to always assume that a defeated budget could happen, and hopefully we don't have to have that contingency budget in place. Now that concludes the entire budget development process. Obviously, this is a public meeting, so any questions that anyone has, myself, Mr. Lamoureux, Assistant Superintendent, and our Board of Education is here that can certainly answer any questions. And so I'll open it up to any public discussion. Yes?
Was there any consideration about cutting anything in administration?
There was not
the total budget?
There was not an ability to, based on current staffing level and need.
Jason?
Yes.
Mr. Superintendent, I just want to add that we made those cuts to the administration back in 13. That's when we addressed that, and we cut several positions out at that time. We went to the CBO you mentioned, which is the Central Business Office of BOCES, to do a lot of our financial and budgeting work, and we made some changes to the cafeteria, and we moved that also to BOCES. So we did make significant reductions in administrative staff back to that.
As well as IT as well.
Yeah, and
That
IT.
all outsourced to BOCES now. We also ran without an assistant superintendent at the high school for several years and found that there was the need to add the position back.
Yeah, no, and thank you. Yeah, so we were at 26 positions, we're down to 15, we were at 14, as Mr. Ricada said, the high school went 2 years with only one assistant principal, and it was difficult. The other part of it is the APPR, teacher evaluation, requires significant administrative support to make it work. And so currently, out of the 15 administrators, there's only one administrator that doesn't do evaluations, and that's Mr. Lamoureux. And the reason why is because part of the law requires there to be a due process where you have to have someone who is objective and is not part of the evaluation system. So we are getting the most we can out of our administrative team.
How much extra time does it take for an administrator to do a teacher assessment?
An evaluation?
Yeah, one evaluation and the write-up. How long does that actually take?
A full evaluation? So there's two evaluations. There's a walkthrough and then there's a full evaluation.
Right. How long total amount of hours do they take? Did anyone figure that out?
3 to 5 hours.
Okay, 3 to 5 hours per teacher.
220 teachers.
Okay.
Yep.
So that to me leaves a lot of extra time for administrators if that's what if that's one of the sole things you're basing that you can't cut administration on, there's a lot of other time and hours. They work
Well-
7.5 hours a day.
Mhm. Well, if you have some suggestions, I'd love to hear them. At this point, I can tell you, they do more than just evaluate teachers, clearly. But that was a state mandate that required their time to be absolutely dedicated to staff evaluation, and we had no choice.
I understand.
But you're right, there are definitely more items that our administrators do than just teacher evaluations. And we did make reductions, there has been reductions made. And I would say this, and I'm not gonna argue the point. If you look at the size of our school district enrollment-wise, and you look at other school districts at their administrative levels, we are at the bottom third for administrators per student enrollment. And that's something we're proud of, because we're not heavy on administrators. We get a lot out of them. And if you compare our staffing of administrators to other school districts, and you consider how successful we are, we must be doing something right. So, again, it's a thin model, and you're not the first person to ask, why aren't we looking at administrators? We look at every area, but unfortunately, that's an area that right now, we don't have an opportunity to go down in. Any other questions? Yep.
In the budget, there's $128,000 that's going for school safety. Okay? Now, where is that coming out of? Is that gonna come out of the capital part of our budget, or is that coming out of the general part of the budget?
So the 128,000 you're referring to, it is not in the budget. We did not budget for that. We had talked about if we were gonna exceed the tax levy limit, that would be some of the use of going out over the tax levy limit.
Well, that would be from capital expenditures only.
No, that would be from general, that would be general fund, that would be personnel. Yeah, that would be your general. So we didn't. We talked about it. The decision to exceed the tax levy limit did not go forward, and so we are not budgeting 128,000.
That was the concept, I think, of one person in each building.
Right, that was the concept. Yep. But we're not doing that. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody again for being here in attendance. Thank you, Board of Education. Thank you, Mr. Balzani, for being in attendance. And thank you for those at home. Again, I just want to remind folks, if they do have some questions and they were unable to make it tonight, or you have any other questions, regardless if it's about the hearing tonight or not, please join us on the budget chat from 7 to 8. Myself, Jeff Lamoureux, our Assistant Superintendent, will be available to answer any questions real time. So I hope you take advantage of that. Thank you very much. Thank you.